Today, our gospel reading, perhaps to the contrary, is Joy Sunday. Gaudete Sunday. It's not Brood of Viper Sunday. It's Pink Candle Sunday. It's a day set aside in this season to focus on joy. Lift it up. Don't you think it's interesting that we would have to remember joy at all? I mean, it's Christmas time. Isn't that how we're supposed to feel every day this time of year? Or maybe that's why the anxiety and the stress of this season feel acutely stronger than they seem to at other times of the year. Because happiness simply becomes one more thing on our to-do list. In our opening collect, the prayer we use to collect ourselves as a community before we enter together into worship, we ask God to do something pretty incredible. We ask God to stir up God's power among us. Can you imagine what that might look like? What would it look like if God were to stir up God's power among us now? I'll bet many of us, all of us perhaps, could imagine that happening in the world in really big ways. I mean, if God stirred up God's power, there would be no more war, no more hunger, no more injustice. Children would be cared for and people would be valued. And the evil forces in this world that lead human beings to acts of horrific violence and degradation would be wiped out and conquered forever. If God's power was stirred up among us, the whole world would be set right. Well, that's why I think it's almost easier for us to imagine God's power being stirred up on that big a world stage. But Advent is really about preparing us for a much more particular truth. Because God did indeed stir up God's power, but God chose to come among us in a very individual way. God's power was stirred up in the form of an infant, a particular person born to a particular family in a very particular time and place. So what would it be like for God to come among me and you like that? If that power was stirred up in your life on this particular day, would it bring joy, sadness, fear, a little mix of all of it? If there's one thing from today, even though there's many, that makes me long for God's presence in that particular way, it's those words from the prophet Zephaniah. Sing aloud and rejoice. Personally, I don't know of anything more joyful than a room filled with people who are singing their hearts out. I think it's one reason we love and long for those Christmas carols of the season. Do not fear, this reading reminds us, God has taken away the judgments against you. Just think of what that might look like in your life. We who are so very good at judging one another and judging ourselves. How wonderful it would be if that burden was lifted from our head and hearts. It says that God will take our shame and turn it into praise. All those things done and left undone. Maybe some things in our lives done years ago that we're ashamed of. Maybe things left undone from just a few days ago. God would take all of that. What are the particular burdens in your life that you would bring to God this morning? Because the prophet is painting for us a picture of hope. And in the Christian faith, as you know, hope is faith in what is not seen, what we cannot see. A belief that all will be renewed, all will be restored, and all will be reconciled and brought to complete fruition and wholeness. All will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Hope is what allows us to know joy in the midst of sadness and struggle. Oftentimes, when I preach at funerals, I point something like that out. Something to the effect of that when we lose someone we love, we actually experience hope in a most profound way. Because we find when we're in that liminal time, when everything feels like it matters, that we are laughing and crying all at once. We're sharing memories and remembering the joy someone brought into our lives while tears stream down our face because our hearts hurt with the sadness of their absence. That's something that I think also happens in this season when we're supposed to be happy, but sometimes there is sadness at a longing for what was or cannot be. And hope is knowing that God will restore all those fortunes, not the fortunes we earn and save, but those priceless and intangible fortunes that fill our hearts and remind us what it is that gives life meaning. Paul, in his letter, encourages us to know joy simply by being kind. Be gentle with yourselves, with everyone. For that is joy-filled living. And then he sort of casually adds, and don't worry about anything. And I think, oh, that's easy for you to say, Paul. But when I remember the context of this letter, I don't think he casually pens it, because he wrote those words from a prison cell, awaiting death. In the first half of his life, he had gone around as Saul, casting stones and judgments with the best of him. But after God entered his life, for 3 days of blindness and the tears were wiped from his eyes, he finally gave those burdens over to God so that he might be renewed. And as Paul, he left condemning people behind him. And through the struggle and sadness and practicing joy of gospel living, he embraced what happens when you spend your days building people up. And it's that practice, I think, or which I imagine in his particular context brings a peace that surpasses understanding and allows him to give his anxieties over to God. I hope you don't mind if I go from some Pauline theology to an animated Pixar movie. But I wonder if any of you saw Pixar's Inside Out last summer, yeah? I could not commend this movie enough. I have a dream that we could all watch it together as a congregation. If you have a young person or even a young adult or really anybody in your life to watch it with, watch it. It's the story of a girl, an 11-year-old, and she has to move the way kids have to move because they're dependent on their parents. But it's not really the story that you would think about the move and the friends and all the people outside her life. It's really a story about her inside life. It's the story of her emotions, anger, fear, disgust, joy, and sadness. They are personified. And we are a part of the struggle that living brings. And all those emotions fight and try their hardest to protect her from the emotion they fear the most, sadness, grief. And Joy in particular does everything she can, spends the whole movie trying to keep every memory and every moment from even being tinged with sorrow, because that will make everything better, right? I mean, if we're just happy all the time, then how can we be sad or scared or angry? But what Joy comes to realize is that there's no joy without the sadness. That's why I say that at the funeral, because the joy and the love wouldn't be so powerful and fill us as meaningful if the loss wasn't there too, if we didn't allow that component into our hearts. There's nothing more powerful than the full-throated singing of a joy-filled, tear-filled, amazing grace at a funeral. Just like there's nothing more moving on Christmas Eve than the silence and candlelight and singing together Silent Night, because we're naming this hope in the midst of lives that have still not been brought to wholeness. There is one line from the story from John the Baptist that I think really connects with this theme today. And it's not what he says, but it's what the people do. The crowds, who are always looking for an answer to their problems, ask John, well, what should we do then to prepare for this good news? And John answers in a very straightforward way. Share your stuff, be honest in your work, and don't get greedy. Apparently, stirring up God's power within ourselves really can be that simple at times. And upon hearing this, the crowds are not filled with hope in their own abilities to live into this. Instead, it says, they are filled with expectations. Expectations that John is the one they've been waiting for, the one who's going to fix it all for them. But you see, it's the expectations that bring all the sadness. The expectations are what the people are going to have to let go of. As the writer Anne Lamont says, our expectations of others are really only resentments and disappointments waiting to happen. These people will be very disappointed that John is not the Messiah, and they will be even more disappointed that Christ fails to meet their expectations of what a Messiah is supposed to do and be, which I think happens with all of us in the course of our lives as God fails to meet our expectations of what a life of faith is supposed to bring us, because we have to work through the sadness that living brings. So I think there's great wisdom in the church that we set aside a day to point out what we believe joy is. In a season of so many expectations being placed on us and everyone else, a season fraught with if only, I wish, shoulda, woulda, coulda, because the good news that we prepare for has nothing to do with that. It isn't something we manufacture or some store-bought Christmas spirit. The good news we prepare for is a life-saving gift of grace, life-saving joy that is offered to each one of you, to me, in our particular circumstances through Christ. A joy that holds us when we weep, a joy that is never ashamed of who we are, but simply seeks to gather us in, to renew our spirits in hope, and lead us into the heart of God, which is our true home. Amen.